title of my talk would be Endpoints and Testing and Chef. And that's really just because that's what I could fit on this slide without really changing the formatting. So I think I submitted my talk. It had a much nicer title, like maybe multi-endpoints and chef and testing or something like that. So when you talk about testing, normally everyone just looks past it, but there's definitely one person who's like, wait, testing? That's pretty exciting. Also, that's a goat in a tree. So about me. My name is Ryan Moon, if you hadn't noticed, and also from the little introduction there. I am a client platform engineer at Slack. I'm also the only client platform engineer at Slack, so not in my, that's kind of fancy there. This is probably the best picture of a goat in a tree that I could find. It's just a great face on him. I don't know why the goats get into trees, but I will be talking a little bit about goats in this talk, so just a forewarning there. I'm on Twitter, @RyanMoon. I'm not really the world's most amazing follow. I talk about sandwiches and about how I'm going to be late because the ferry's running slow, because I take the ferry into work. It's pretty exciting stuff. Yeah, you're already on my follow list. I'm on the Mac admin Slack, @RyanMoon. And then I'm also on the Chef community Slack, @Moon. So if you ever needed to find me, probably Slack is the best way to do that, because since I work at Slack, I tend to spend most of my day and all my time in Slack. It's kind of a perfect marriage. So let's get to the talk part. So as you may guess, I'm going to talk about Chef. And I'm going to talk about endpoints, and I'm going to talk about testing, because that was in the title, and you were paying attention. But I also want to give you a little bit of history about myself. So a little bit about my journey to getting to this point. I'm a failed audio engineer, meaning that I went to college for audio engineering, and then I decided to go to grad school for audio engineering, and then I never graduated, and then I tried to find a job, and they're like, cool, you can work for free for 60 hours a week. And then I was like, I'll do computers. That's so much easier. Then I followed into working for a repair shop. My first job was repairing about 50 Bondi Blue iMacs. And after my 40th one, someone told me about the CRT discharge. So thankfully, I didn't die. Then I graduated to being a Mac genius, which nobody's ever done. I'm kidding. There's probably about 40 people in here who have either worked at an Apple store or been a Mac genius and then decided to leave. And then at that point, I decided, hey, my future seems pretty bright repairing iPod minis, but maybe I want to move into system administration. So that's what I did. And I've worked at a couple different advertising firms. I worked at a movie trailer house. Really fun. If you want to talk about fun stuff with audits, try going through an MPAA audit. They mentioned it's voluntary, so I said, no thanks. Turns out it's not voluntary. They actually mean we're coming over. Then after that, I started working at a small company that worked out of the YouTube space in Los Angeles. So from there, I was managing a whole bunch of stuff in all the machines that the creators would touch in Los Angeles, New York, and Rio. Sadly, I never got to go to Rio, but a lot of the work I was doing was in Rio. So I was virtually there. It's probably not the same. Then I decided that I wanted to move to San Francisco, and I started at Slack. So I've been at Slack since about October. So right around the time when the Napa wildfires ended, I moved in. So, the fires were just kind of letting everyone know what was about to happen. All those things said, I have a family. I have 2 kids at home, and I spend a lot of my time reading children's stories outside of the client platform engineering that I do. I might think that I'm good at client platform engineering. I'm sure my kids think I'm a lot better at reading stories. There's one story in particular that we read a lot. It's the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. It's basically a collection of Winnie the Pooh stories. And there's a story in there, Owl's Reading Lessons. And if you're not familiar with it, don't worry, you're not going to miss anything out. In the very beginning of the story, Owl's reading a story to all of the characters, and there's a throwaway line in there, and every time I read it, I start thinking about it so much more. The throwaway line is ... and the goat became the best clockmaker in town and lived happily ever after. And then they just go on to the rest of the story about how the other characters feel bad because Owl reads the stories. But I'm like, wait, let's talk about that goat. Because it's never mentioned again in any of the other stories. And unfortunately, after I read that particular story, it happens upon my youngest daughter's favorite story, Under the Weather Friends, which she just refers to as Achu Poo. So I'm trying to ask the kids about questions about goats and what happened and why there's a clockmaker. She just wants to read the next story. So all that being said, it's such kind of a throwaway line, but I think also when you're doing anything, whether it be endpoint management, monkey repos, anything like that, like the testing component of it can kind of be one of those things that you say and then never really think about again, much like that line about the goat. So I want to kind of present the idea that testing as well as deployment and all these different things is really something that should be part of your workflow, should be something you strive to do, and you can do it in kind of steps. You know, you don't have to have the most amazing testing devices in progress. It can kind of always be along the lines of that's something I'm going to get to. And one of the reasons I particularly became focused on testing is because one time I broke sudoers. Now, I know managing sudoers is basically the equivalent of never getting into a land war in Asia, but I had to manage it because I was managing a lab environment and there were a couple commands I needed to get done. So I started messing around with sudoers.d. And I don't know if you've ever seen that, but there's a comment in front of it, but it's not actually a comment. So I hosed that, deployed it out to the fleet, and I caught it by the time it reached about 80 machines. Now, I don't know if you've ever broken sudoers, but you can't SSH into a machine and fix it. You've got to go into the GUI and do a silly little dance workaround. So after I did that and felt really incredibly silly, I thought, I got to do something so that I don't get in my own way, or basically I keep myself from hurting myself. That's kind of the whole idea there. So testing really became a big part of what I do. And when I started at Slack, I was tasked with, or I currently am tasked with, moving our whole fleet of endpoints over to being managed with Chef. So it's pretty easy to do for a new machine. And I did suggest that we buy everyone new machines several times. It didn't go well. We didn't quite have the budget for it. So I did have to do about a bunch of like managing a machine midstream. It's middle of its life. It's been managed with one system. We're now managing with a different system. And one of my secret professional goals is to be loved as much as Norm was in Cheers. But just when I walk into the office, everyone's like, Moon! And then, you know, it's just me eating Cinnamon Toast Crunch by myself. But one day, I'm going to get there. And my path towards getting there is making sure that I don't break anyone's machine. So, back to testing. So, when talking about Chef and stuff like that, actually, let me back up just a little bit because I didn't really talk about like what my expectation as to your level of knowledge or wherewithal, what have you, during my talk. So, I'm going to be talking about kind of a higher level Chef stuff. So if you've done any type of Chef management, this will apply. If you haven't, it may scare you away from doing it. You're just like, I'm going to stick to Bash scripts for the rest of my life. That's great. Or Python, or maybe even Swift. I hear it's a new thing. So that being said, so I should also put this disclaimer out that we do manage our endpoints with Chef, but I don't use the Facebook method. So Facebook has done an amazing job of open sourcing all of their, or not all of them, but a good chunk of their cookbooks on how you can manage your endpoints with Chef. I don't use that particular way. I kind of think of it as using a different Maps application. So Facebook's method is, let's say, a particularly good Maps application, and my method is another good application, and we're just ending up at the same destination. So no matter what tool you're going to use here, we really just want a managed endpoint that's secure and all the different things like that. So that being said, let's talk about testing, particularly with Chef stuff. So the first type of that I want to talk about is linting. Now, linting your code is probably the least amount of effort you can put into testing, but also saves you a bunch of problems. A real nice trick that I like to do is add a post or a Git hook so that I do linting right before I commit code to anything like that. So I save myself, oh, hey, I missed a Robocop error and I committed it, and then we find out later on it's a horrible thing. So with Chef, you have two types of linting. The first one And this kind of pays into the whole thing of everything in Chef is a really bad dad joke. So you have Food Critic. Now, Food Critic is really great to testing your code against like structural problems that you may have. Say you created a template, but you never put the source in place. It'll catch those kind of simple errors. Or if you're trying to do something really kind of crazy, it's going to do a pretty good job of telling you, hey, you did this. Now, it's taken me a very long time to figure out all the intricacies of this, but also how you can skip particular critic rules. And one of the ones I don't like is Food Critic. I think it's either 76 or 78 that insists that you use an open source license for your cookbooks, which is really great if you're doing an open source cookbook. But if you're using a private one, the workaround for it is just to ignore it, which is just a tilde and then a comment, then FC078 in your particular code, or you can set up a Food Critic rule in your Chef repo. So that's going to help you kind of think about like how Chef's going to be applied and what you may be doing right or wrong, particularly at that. And passing tests is always a good thing. The next one up is Robocop. Now, Robocop is going to test your code for all of your kind of your Ruby intricacies, or oh gosh, I can't pronounce it, but say Ruby stuff, we'll say that. So your Ruby stuff, and the nice thing about Robocop is you can give it a set of rules that works just specifically for you. Like your line can't be longer than 80 characters. I live in the year 2018. I want, 140. Deal with it, Robocop. I'm going to tell you how to do that. And you can make all these changes that'll fit your environment best. And the whole beautiful thing about configuration management is that really only you know what works for your environment. No one else has, that great idea of like, hey, you're doing this in your environment completely wrong because you're the person doing it. So you can modify Robocop a little bit and make it work for you just the same as you can for Food Critic. So all of those two tools are just going to look at your code and let you know if you've done something blatantly wrong before you've actually done it. And that takes not much time. And you can really do that to any type of Ruby code, particularly Food Critic for Chef code. But I think really linting is really the first step in doing testing. If you're doing linting, let's say you're 60% of the way there. It's a good step. It's like flossing. As long as you also brush your teeth, you're going to be good. If you just floss, I don't know. I might try that, though. That might be a good idea. So the next bit I want to talk about is unit testing. Now, unit testing, the way that I think of it with Chef is when you're doing unit testing with Chef, you're just testing to see if Chef's going to do the thing that I told it to do and do it right. Now, I like to use Chef Spec, which is just a set of specifications built on top of RSpec, but you can also use RSpec. Now, granted, nobody really likes this part when they start having to write tests because it's like, this is a whole abstract level of learning that I have to apply on top of, and I'm just learning the Chef stuff. But I will say that the Chef Spec community has done a really great job in the examples of providing you with plenty of examples of most any type of Chef basic resource that you're going to use. It's going to provide you with a code example and then an example of how to write a Chef Spec test for it. And it's always based around like foo and bacon and stuff like that. And I don't know. I never like the foo examples. I'm like, just give it a word. Like name it giraffe. We want to know what's going on with giraffes. So what a Chef Spec test will look like is a bunch of code. But this is a really small version of it, and this is taken from our production cookbooks. We have a secret cookbook called Mac OS X Branding that puts desktop pictures on machines. So you could use this, but I wanted to talk about a little brief thing that we're doing that I found like just smattering over all the Google searches I've ever done with Chef, which is a horrible Google search to do. My pro tip would be throw Chef, ops code, and Ruby in any search you're going to do, and most of the time you will not get anything that has to do with a reality TV show about cooking. But if you just do a Chef knife search, best of luck on that one. Anyway, so Chef Spec test. There's a kind of neat thing here. What we're doing is we're running this Ruby gem called Fohi, and it mocks up all of the different things that would be potentially on a system. So what we're doing here is we're testing against 10.12 and 10.13. And we're expecting that when the chef recipe would run, it's going to put our desktop, our Slack wallpaper file in the desktop's picture folder. And this is not running any code. This is all going to run into memory. And the nice thing about a chef spec test is you can run this, and 10 seconds later, you have a pretty good idea of what you're trying to do is actually going to work. Now, you can get really super complicated with these tests. And I think there's a real decision you have to make of whether or not you're going to spend your whole life writing tests, or if you're going to write your life writing production code. And your superiors are probably going to want you to write production code because things actually do it. But you want to write tests so that you don't cause production to fail. So I really think there's a kind of middle ground to be met there, but I really try and keep my chef spec tests really simple, just as like, hey, does the file exist? Does it have, maybe its owner is, Tom or Mr. Giraffe or something along those lines, so that you're testing to see what your code can actually do. Now, this comes with a caveat. If you're talking about custom resources, you have to do a thing called stepping into. And that sounds like something you don't really want to do. No one really wants to step into, and then you can fill in the adjective, and most of the time you don't want to step in that. But in this particular instance, you're talking about the resource you want to use. And then you can get into the underlying levels of that particular resource. I don't have an example for that because I'd have to show you a bunch of code, and there'd be slides and slides of code, and it wouldn't be the most exciting thing ever. But if you want to start testing any custom resources you have, or maybe use the Facebook like remote PKG one, you can kind of work around seeing how you can test that within your cookbook so that you get complete code coverage. There's a little flag you can throw in your RSpec, I think it's your spec helper, to where you do a code climate check, and at the very end of it, it's like, hey, all your tests passed, you're completely awesome. That's a really nice thing when a computer tells you you're completely awesome. I try and get that every day. So the next level of testing would be integration testing. Now, some people like to just test on a small set of machines in production, and that's how you're getting your integration testing. I like to test on VMware because I don't know, I have a thing for pain apparently. But there's a couple really great tools that you can use to test on what would be essentially a clean OS with however fixings you want to do on it. Vagrant and VMware, there's a Vagrant VMware Fusion plugin, so you can do a couple different nice things with that, particularly on the Mac side, and then also on the Windows side. Unfortunately, we're hosed because those two particular OSs aren't like easily available in dummy VMware images. If everything was Ubuntu, it'd be great, because if you're testing servers, this particular part of it is really super easy. But unfortunately, that's not the life we live. So what I use for testing in integration testing is a thing called InSpec. And this used to be called ServerSpec. Well, ServerSpec might actually still exist, but InSpec has kind of become the real soup of the year. So I don't know that part in French. Does anybody? How would you say soup of the year in French? I thought we were in Canada. Anyway, just move past that. You guys know airport codes. I asked for a simple French phrase. Nothing. Nothing. That's fair enough. That's fair enough. But I mean, it's a global community. So the InSpec page is definitely a little shinier than the other ones I showed you. And there's a whole bunch of information on InSpec, but you're really just kind of writing almost a similar test to what you do for chef spec. So for instance, again, I'm with the whole desktop pictures, the Slack wallpaper, and I'm doing a couple of tests here. I'm like, it should exist. It should not be a directory. It should be a file. It should be owned by root. You could say that if I get should exist, it's like, yeah, the file exists. It's like if I'm saying it should be a file, that's already including the idea of it exists. So exist may be a kind of a redundant test in here, but I just wanted to show that you could kind of go crazy if you wanted. You could have 20 different things that you're checking for in a particular file, and that's pretty great. So the really nice thing that you can do if you really kind of go deep on the whole testing thing is you can put a rake file in your Cookbook repository. Since I've kind of subscribe to the Berkshelf method for Chef. All of our cookbooks are individual repos. So much to the chagrin of my coworker Patrick, if I were to make a change across, say, all of the cookbooks, he has 40 pull requests to do. But it also, I kind of use the same code across. So we have a template tool, the Chef Cookbook Generator. It puts the same rake file on every particular thing, and it's a little easier to remember what the intricacies of calling these commands are. So, for instance, if you have a rake file, you can do fancy things like, chef exec rake lint, and that's going to run all of my linting tests. So I'm running Food Critic, I'm running Robocop, my unit testing, same kind of idea there. And then my integration testing, which is going to take a while, because I don't know if you've ever tried, running a test across 3 different versions of macOS at the same time. You're going to be sitting there waiting for a while. So the beautiful thing is, though, by utilizing all these different types of testing, you get a really great idea of what's going on in your cookbook and what it's going to do before you even get to the point where this code meets anyone's machine or causes their machine to catch on fire or anything like that. We've never done that yet. So I did want to say thanks. I want to say thanks to a couple of my coworkers who are here. So Dana and TJ are here, and I know TJ really showed up for the technical part of this, and I appreciate that, Teach. I want to say thanks to my team. If you're wondering why I wasn't at any of the meetings or really not doing anything on Slack today, it's because I'm in Canada. The internet works here, but I still wasn't going to do any work. And then I'd just like to say thanks to all of you for listening to me ramble on about testing, and particularly Chef. And all of you seemed rather, engaged, and I really appreciated that. You may not have anything to do. You might not do all of your endpoint management with, Python scripts, but you guys, we went along. We worked with it, and really, that's how the Goat became the best clockmaker in all of town. So, if anyone has any questions, I'll answer those now.